How did people sleep in the Middle Ages when there was no central heating, no soft mattresses, not even silence? We imagine dark, cold nights as endless misery. But what if the medieval English peasant, huddled in his smoky hut, actually slept better and perhaps even truer than we do in our warm, comfortable, but stress-filled bedrooms? This story takes you to a world where sleep was not just a rest, but an art of survival, a complex system of rituals, tricks, and social practices developed over centuries to combat cold and darkness. This is the story of how our ancestors turned their humble dwellings into warm cocoons and their families into living warmers. How did they use the laws of physics without knowing them? Why were their dirty clothes more effective than our clean ones? And what sleep rhythm, forgotten today, may be the key to our own health? Today we're going to reveal 10 ingenious ways that help medieval Englishmen not just survive the freezing winter, but also get a good night's sleep. Are you ready to learn that sleep in the past was not torture, but a surprisingly clever strategy? Then let's get started. At dusk, a church bell was rung throughout medieval England. It was the Firebell, or curfew from the old French couvre-feu, to cover the fire. For a peasant family, it was not just a bedtime signal, but the beginning of an important evening ritual honed over centuries. The fire in the hearth, the main source of heat and light, was too valuable to burn all night. It had to be canned. This term is not accidental. In many English towns and villages, ringing the bell in the evenings was not just a custom, but an official regulation, a fire safety measure in a world of wooden houses and thatched roofs. At this signal, every householder was obliged to dim his hearth to prevent night fires that could destroy the entire village. Thus, the personal stratagem of saving fuel was woven into the public safety system. The master of the house would gather the largest, hottest coals into the center of the hearth and carefully cover them with a thick layer of ash. It was an art. He had to choose the right coals, from hardwoods such as oak or beech, which smoldered long and hot, unlike alder, which burned quickly. The layer of ash, itself an excellent insulator, had to be not too thick so as not to smother the heat completely, but also not too thin so that the embers would not burn out before morning. This procedure cut off the oxygen supply, and the fire went into a slow, economical smoldering mode, keeping the precious heat in its core for 8 to 10 hours until morning. As the fire went to sleep, the family prepared for the night. The process was like battening down the hatches on a ship before a storm. The door, which was made of rough boards and never fit tightly, was plugged around the perimeter with moss, hemp, or old rags. A heavy hide or a piece of felt was hung on top of it from the inside to create an additional barrier. Window openings, if there were any, were closed tightly with wooden shutters. The poultry were driven into special wicker cages in the corner of the hut, and the cattle in the stable received their last portion of hay. All the life in the house stopped, shrinking, preparing to face the long and cold night full of danger. This ritual was not only practical but also deeply psychological. The sound of the bell, the procedure of covering the fire, plugging the gaps, all this created a sense of order, control, and security in the face of the night darkness, which in the medieval mind was inhabited not only by cold, but also by evil spirits. It was a collective action that united the whole village in common preparation for the night's rest. And when the house was finally sealed and the fire was safely covered, the main living heating system, the family itself, came into action. In a peasant hut, there were no separate bedrooms and, in most cases, not even beds as we understand them. The whole bed was one big straw mattress or just a thick layer of straw spread on the earthen floor or on a low wooden plank in the warmest corner of the room. And on this common bed slept the whole family, from infants to old people, turning into a single human furnace. It was the most efficient, the oldest and absolutely free heating system known to mankind. The principle was simple, and its genius lay in its understanding of the laws of physics. The tighter bodies are pressed together, the smaller their total surface area in contact with cold air, and the more efficiently they retain heat. The arrangement on this bed was strictly hierarchized and thought out to the smallest detail. In the very center, as the warmest and safest place, the youngest children and infants were placed. They were surrounded on all sides by the bodies of adults and older children. creating a living, warm cocoon, protected from any draft. The strongest and healthiest adults, usually the father and eldest sons, lay on the edges. They served as a kind of outer walls, taking the brunt of the cold coming from the walls and floor. Old people, who were more sensitive to the cold, also tried to sit closer to the center, next to the children. Often a dog would lie at their feet, at the very edge of the lodge, or even on top of the skins that covered the family. Its warmth was a valuable addition to the common furnace. This collective sleeping arrangement was not just a forced measure due to cramped quarters. It was a conscious survival strategy. People intuitively realized that together they were a force. The breath of several people, concentrated under a common shelter, made the air in close proximity to their faces a little warmer and more humid. The heat generated by the bodies was trapped under a common shelter, be it a heavy sheepskin or a rough patchwork quilt sewn from hundreds of scraps of old clothes. This created a unique microclimate that made it possible to survive even the most severe frosts. This way of sleeping also incredibly strengthened family and community bonds. Physical proximity created a sense of unity, security, and absolute trust. In total darkness and bitter cold, the touch and steady breathing of a loved one sleeping next to you was the best comfort and protection from nighttime fears. Thus, every night the peasant family turned into a single living organism, which with its cohesion and collective warmth resisted death from hypothermia. But the peasants had another source of living warmth, which was often just behind a thin partition. Many medieval English peasant houses, especially in the northern and harsher regions, were of the longhouse type. This was an elongated structure with both the human dwelling and the byre under one long thatched roof, separated only by a thin inner wall of wicker and clay or by a wattle and daub fence. To the hygiene-obsessed modern man, such a neighborhood seems a height of unsanitary, but to the medieval peasant, it was an ingenious heating trick, the difference between life and death. A cow, a few sheep or pigs kept in a stable were real living radiators. A large animal, such as a cow, in the course of its life generates a tremendous amount of heat comparable to that of a small heater. This heat warmed the common wall between the stable and the living part of the house, making it noticeably warmer than the other walls. The family instinctively tried to make their common bed by this warm wall, receiving additional passive heating. In addition, the slow rotting process of manure and straw bedding in the stable also generated heat. This biothermal process, known today to gardeners as the warm bed principle, additionally heated the earthen floor of the stable and consequently the adjacent living space. The smell, of course, was corresponding, pungent and maniacal, mixed with the smell of straw. But they got used to it, and the advantages of additional heat outweighed all the inconveniences. Moreover, the smoke from the hearth, which penetrated into the stable, served as a disinfectant and repelled insects. This house structure was a perfect closed ecosystem. Cattle provided not only milk, meat, and wool, but also warmth and even valuable fertilizer in the spring. The people, in turn, protected their animals from bad weather and predators such as wolves or foxes. It was a perfect symbiosis, dictated by harsh necessity and a deep understanding of nature. In the bitterest frosts, especially during calving, the weakest lambs or calves could be brought directly into the living part of the house and laid by the hearth. Their small, shivering bodies were not only an object of care, but also an additional source of warmth, and their rescue was a guarantee of the future well-being of the family. Thus, the whole house, from people to animals, worked as a single complex heating system where each element contributed to the common cause of survival. And the basis and insulation of the system was simple, but indispensable: straw. Cold in a peasant hut came from everywhere, but its main sources were the icy earth floor and cold walls. To create a barrier between the body and the cold surface, peasants used the most accessible and universal insulating material: straw. They didn't just sleep on it, they literally created a warm cocoon of it for sleeping, a multi-layered system where each layer had its own function. It was not a whim, but a well-thought-out survival technique. First, as we already know, straw was used to stuff mattresses. A thick, densely packed straw mattress, or pallet, created an elastic air layer that prevented the cold from the ground from rising to the body. The quality of the straw was important. Softer and more resilient oat or barley straw was used for the mattresses, while the stiff wheat straw was used for the floor. The mattress was the main barrier separating the warmth of the human body from the permafrost of the earth. Second, a thick layer of straw or dry fern covered the entire floor of the hut. This was not just garbage, but deep bedding. The lower layers, mixed with earth, food, and waste products, began to slowly rot and decompose, releasing a small but constant geothermal heat. In this way, the floor itself became a low-temperature heater. The top layers were regularly renewed to keep them relatively dry and clean. The bedding was certainly teeming with life, from mice to fleas, but warmth was more important. But there was a third, less obvious trick. On the coldest nights, peasants could cover their beds on all sides with armfuls or tight sheaves of straw. They created a kind of low temporary wall, a nest, which protected them from the drafts traveling across the floor. A family sleeping on a mattress and surrounded on all sides by these straw ramparts was in the center of a warm, insulated cocoon. Often, such a straw wall separated the sleeping people from the cold outer wall of the hut, creating an additional insulating gap. Sometimes straw was even leaned against the coldest walls on the inside, or stuffed between the wooden paneling, if there was any, and the main wall. Yes, this was extremely fire hazardous, and a single spark from the hearth could spell disaster. It was also unhygienic. But in the desperate struggle for survival, when the lives of children were at stake, all means were good, and warmth was an absolute priority. And to keep this hard-won warmth from leaving the body, the peasant wore a special, smart armor. The clothes of the medieval English peasant were his main defense, his personal shelter, which he wore around the clock. And here, too, there was an ingenious trick, which to a modern man, obsessed with purity, will seem strange and even repulsive. The secret lay not only in the multiple layers, but also in the fact that woolen clothes were almost never washed, especially in winter. The upper garments, tunics and cloaks, were made of coarse, homespun sheep's wool. Wool that had not been washed or only lightly washed in cold water retained its natural animal fat, lanolin. This substance, which protects the sheep themselves from the weather, has excellent water-repellent properties. The lanolin-impregnated garment was hardly ever wet in rain or sleet. Droplets simply rolled off its greasy surface without penetrating inside. This was vital for people who spent a lot of time outdoors. Moreover, lanolin made wool fibers more elastic and dense, and the fabric itself more windproof. Such dirty, greasy clothes were much warmer and more functional than clean, soft, and fluffy ones. Sure, it had a peculiar smell of sheepskin mixed with the smell of sweat and smoke, and it was stiff to the touch, but these shortcomings were more than compensated for by its unrivaled protective properties. Washing, especially with the use of aggressive lye, a mixture of ash and water, completely washed out the precious lanolin, making the clothes vulnerable to moisture and wind. Therefore, only the lower linen shirts that were in direct contact with the body were washed. The woolen outer garments were only periodically shaken out, brushed with a stiff bristle brush, and ventilated by the fire. This may seem unhygienic to us, but from the point of view of survival in the damp and cold English climate, it was a perfectly sensible and ingenious solution. The very structure of the wool fiber, its natural curvature, creates millions of tiny air pockets. It is this trapped air, not the fiber itself, that is the main insulator. Wool is unique in that it retains this structure and its insulating properties even when wet, unlike cotton or linen. This wisdom, not to let nature do its work and to use its properties to the maximum, was also manifested in the attitude towards the natural rhythm of day and night. In a world without electricity, darkness meant the end of activity, and there was a deep wisdom in this that we have almost lost today. Medieval peasants did not try to conquer the night with bright artificial light. They embraced it and lived in harmony with the natural cycles of light and darkness, which modern research shows could be much healthier. As the sun set, the family gathered around the hearth. Any extra light, a rash light or tallow candle, was prized and used sparingly. People spent most of the evening in semi-darkness, in the uneven light of the fire. This naturally prepared the body for sleep. The brain, not receiving bright light stimuli, as from our modern lamps and screens, began to produce melatonin, the sleep hormone, in time. Peasants went to bed very early, shortly after sunset. Their sleep was often biphasic or segmented. The first sleep lasted a few hours before midnight. This was followed by a period of nightly wakefulness lasting an hour and a half. This period, called vigil, was not considered insomnia, but a normal and productive part of the night. During this time, people could talk quietly, make love, pray, reflect on the day, or just sit in silence around smoldering embers. Then they would go back to sleep, falling into a second sleep that lasted until dawn. Modern sleep scientists and historians, such as Roger Eckrich, believe that such segmented sleep may be more natural to humans than our monolithic 8-hour sleep pattern, which is a product of the industrial age. The imposed need to sleep through the night without interruption may be one of the causes of many modern sleep disorders. Our ancestors may have slept more intermittently, but their sleep was deeper and better synchronized with their internal biological clock. Thus, the darkness of the Middle Ages was not only a deprivation, but also a blessing. It forced people to live in the rhythm of nature, which had a positive effect on their health and well-being. They did not suffer from insomnia caused by the blue light of the screens. Their circadian rhythms were in perfect harmony with the world around them, and the night vigil provided a unique opportunity for quiet reflection and intimacy that is so lacking in our hectic world. But sometimes body heat and fire alone were not enough, and then simple but effective external sources of heat came into play. Getting into a cold, damp bed of straw in an unheated hut was a real challenge. The sudden change in temperature could cause chills and even sickness. To make this process at least a little more pleasant and to warm up faster, peasants used primitive but ingenious warmers, using the main heat accumulator in the house, the hearth. The simplest and most common variant was an ordinary stone. A smooth, flat river stone or a piece of sandstone that would not crack from the heat was chosen. During the day or evening, it was kept in hot ashes at the edge of the hearth. Before going to bed, this heated stone was quickly removed with special tongs or just sticks and wrapped in several layers of old dense cloth or a piece of sheepskin to avoid burning and to keep it warm longer. This homemade heating pad was placed in bed, usually in the feet, sometime before going to bed. The stone slowly and evenly gave its heat to the straw mattress, warming it and, importantly, evaporating the excess moisture that had risen from the earthen floor. It was incomparably more pleasant and safer for health to climb into an already warm and dry nest. Sometimes such a stone was left in the feet for the whole night as a source of constant, though diminishing heat, or moved it to the back. Another trick was the use of hot ashes. The ashes and small, long, smoldering embers from the hearth were poured into a sturdy clay pot with a tight lid. Such a pot also became an excellent and durable warming pot that could be placed in the bed. It was safer than open fryers and gave a gentle, long-lasting heat for several hours. In wealthier homes, metal bed warming pans, a kind of frying pan with a long handle and lid that was filled with coals and swept over the bed before going to sleep, could also be used. These simple methods were available to every family and required no extra cost. They were part of the daily evening routine, a small ritual that made a harsh winter night a little more bearable. This art of using stored heat was one of the most important household tricks to cheat the cold. But all these tricks inside the house would be useless if there were no way to defend against the main enemy, the ubiquitous draft. The hut of rods and clay, for all its breathable advantage, was not airtight. The icy winter wind, relentless and omnipresent, found hundreds of loopholes to get inside and blow away the precious, hard-won warmth. Therefore, one of the main winter concerns of the peasant was a total, methodical war against drafts, turning his house into the likeness of a besieged fortress where every inch of defense mattered. Finding drafts was a real art. The master could light a flashlight and slowly walk around the perimeter of the hut, watching where the flame began to quiver and bow against the wall. This spot was immediately marked and became the object of repair. The main battleground was the door. The wooden door, made of rough, often uneven boards, never fit tightly to the jamb. That's why a heavy curtain was hung on it from the inside for the winter. Ideally, it was a thick cowhide or bear skin, which with its weight and density kept out the wind. In poorer houses, a piece of dense felt or several layers of burlap. This essentially created a primitive but effective vestibule or airlock system. The outer wooden door was opened briefly to get in or out, and a heavy inner curtain kept the icy air out of the main living space. All known cracks in the walls were carefully caulked. For this purpose, they used moss, soot, old rags, woolen hams mixed with clay and manure for viscosity. In the fall, the whole family was engaged in this work, carefully inspecting every inch of the walls, especially in the corners and at the base. The foot of the walls, where they joined the earthen floor, was often covered with dense rolls of tightly twisted straw or cut layers of turf to block the coldest airflow traveling across the floor. The window openings, as already mentioned, were practically sealed for the winter, but even closed wooden shutters let the wind through. Therefore, they were additionally covered with cloth from the inside, and all the gaps around the frame were carefully plugged with moss or covered with clay. But here the peasant faced a dilemma: a smoke hole in the roof. It could not be sealed completely, otherwise the whole family would suffocate from the smoke. So a simple wooden flap was often made for it, or a flat stone was adapted to partially cover the opening during a heavy snowstorm or wind, leaving only a small gap for the draft. It was a constant, dangerous compromise between keeping warm and the risk of burning. Furniture was also used in this war. A massive grain chest or bench was pushed against the coldest windward wall, creating an additional barrier. The common bed itself, as we know, was placed as far away from the door as possible and in the most draft-proof corner. This elaborate strategy of total isolation was the key to keeping warm. But even in the most sealed hut, the long hours of darkness had to be endured. And here the special psychology of winter sleep came to the rescue. Survival in winter was not only a physical, but also the toughest psychological challenge. Long, dark nights, penetrating cold, monotony of food, boredom, and constant subconscious fear. All this put pressure on the psyche. And sleep under these conditions was not just a physiological need, but a kind of mental strategy, a way to survive the most difficult and depressing time of the year. Winter was a time of natural slowing down, almost human hibernation. When work in the field stopped and the daylight hours shrank to a few hours, life went into energy conservation mode. People slept more, not only because it was dark, but also because sleep helped to save precious calories, which were in short supply in the meager winter diet. Long, albeit intermittent, sleep was a way to sleep through the hunger and cold, to shorten the agonizing time spent awake in a dank hut. It was also a time for inner peace, for strengthening intangible ties. In the quiet of the long evenings, lulled by the crackling of the hearth and the howling of the wind outside, people immersed themselves in the world of oral tradition. This was the prime season for storytelling. Legends of saints and heroes, spooky tales of ghosts and fairies. Old men passed on their experience to the young. Mothers taught their daughters to spin by firelight. Sleep was often interspersed with slumber and reflection on these stories. This was not the anxious sleep of modern man, preoccupied with deadlines. It was a sleep woven into the natural rhythm of nature and culture. Acceptance of discomfort was a key element of this psychology. The medieval peasant did not expect sleep to be comfortable in our sense. He did not complain about a hard bed, about his neighbor's snoring, or about being poked in his sleep by a goat. His body had been accustomed to hardship since childhood, and his mind to patience. Comfort was not a soft bed, but simply having a roof over one's head, no penetrating wind, and the warmth of a living creature nearby. Their scale of comfort was quite different, and that was their strength. This mental adaptability, the ability to find peace and solace in the simplest things, the warmth of the hearth, the closeness of family, the ancient stories of ancestors, was the invisible force that helped them survive the winter. Their sleep was not an escape from reality, but a complete acceptance of it, an immersion in its slow, dark, but natural rhythm. Yet the main factor that allowed all these individual and family intricacies to work to their fullest potential was not just personal fortitude, but the collective strength of the entire community. Perhaps the most important and most ingenious trick that enabled medieval English peasants to survive harsh winters was not technology or material, but their social structure. a strong rural community. It was almost impossible to survive alone in those conditions, cut off from neighbors. Only together, weaving their lives into a single network of mutual help, could they resist cold, hunger, and disease. Winter was a time when collectivism and the unwritten laws of moral economy were particularly pronounced. It was a system of mutual obligations. I help you today because I know that you will help me tomorrow when trouble comes to my house. Neighbors helped each other in gathering firewood, in urgently repairing a leaky roof. If one family ran out of grain, the other families, even if they had little themselves, shared the last of it. To refuse help was to put oneself outside the community, which was tantamount to a death sentence. Special care was shown to the most vulnerable. The sick and elderly were not left to fend for themselves. They were cared for by the whole community. Someone brought food, someone brought firewood, someone simply came to check on them and sit by their bedside. Widows and orphans were also looked after together, helping them to manage their households. People spent the long winter evenings together. Often several families would gather in one, the most spacious and warmest hut, to save fuel and pass the time. Women would spin and weave together by the light of the same hearth. Men would repair tools, tell stories, and sing songs. This common pastime not only helped to fight boredom, but also strengthened social ties, gave a sense of unity and psychological support. Community festivals such as Christmas and the following 12 days of holy days were not just entertainment, but an essential social ritual. On these days, despite the scarcity of supplies, everyone tried to organize a common meal, forget about hardships, rejoice and support each other's hope for the best. This collective warmth, both physical from the many bodies in one room and mental, was a powerful weapon against the gloom and despair that winter brought with it. Even in everyday tasks, there was mutual assistance. Sharing resources, for example, one large oven for several families to bake bread, or a common well, was the norm. The peasant community was a complex, self-regulating organism where each member depended on others and at the same time was responsible for others. This social cohesion was the invisible shield that protected the peasants better than any wall. Unlike the castle, where a strict hierarchy reigned, in the peasant community, despite all the internal conflicts, the principle of mutual aid prevailed. And this ingenious trick of sticking together allowed them not only to survive, but also to retain their humanity in the most inhuman conditions. The life of a medieval English peasant in winter was full of hardship and difficulty, but it was not a story of hopelessness. It was a story of incredible resilience and ingenuity, a story of how people with next to nothing managed to create warmth and sustain life through ingenious and simple tricks. They built breathable houses of clay and straw, lived in cramped quarters to conserve heat, turned their animals into living batteries and the darkness into an ally. Their food was a simple but effective fuel, and their clothing a reliable armor of wool. But their main trick was cohesion, the ability to survive not alone, but together as a community. Studying their experience, we see that genius is not always about sophisticated technology and expensive materials. Sometimes it manifests itself in a deep understanding of nature, in the ability to make the most of what is at hand, and, most importantly, in the power of human connection. The story of the survival of medieval peasants is a hymn to human adaptation and indomitable spirit. If you are interested in this journey into the past, and you want to know more about how our ancestors solved problems that seem unsolvable to us, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more amazing stories about forgotten tricks and ingenious ideas born in the depths of centuries ahead of you.